Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 83 on Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. I'm especially pleased to do this sequel episode with Carey because 10 episodes ago we did this really phenomenal topic on the cosmic mountain, and we drew so many of the ancient Near East material and parallel with the Old Testament. And thankfully to Dr. Michael Morales and some other scholars, using their material and books, we are learning so much. And whenever I do episodes with Carey, we learn so much when it comes to biblical theology. And episodes with her are always one of my favorite ones because there's so much rich and depth when it comes to biblical theology and how we can understand how did the ancient Jews see God and what was their cosmology. So before we start diving as the sequel to that episode from 10 episodes ago, and I included even the link for that episode that you should go and see as the context to this following episode, I would like to ask Carey to reintroduce herself and tell us something about her podcast. Carey, welcome again. How is everything with you? And tell us, how is your podcast going?
Hey, thanks for having me on again. I'm glad to be here. This is one of my favorite types of things to talk about, these kinds of subjects. But yeah, things are going pretty well. My podcast, Genesis Marks the Spot, is going well. Right now, I'm talking about human sexuality and interrelationships and marriage, things like that, which is a topic I've been meaning to get to for a while because, of course, Genesis has a lot to say about that. But finally getting into all of that. So if anyone's interested in those topics, you can check out my podcast, Genesis Marks the Spot. I started in episode 92 talking about gender, and I'm talking about marriage and the definition of marriage according to what the Bible says about that.
By the way, I want to say that I really like your background. It's so creative, it's so colorful, it's really amazing. It seems like you're about to go on some adventure like Indiana Jones, but not to find the treasure, to find some theological, spiritual treasure and find out some, mysteries hidden in the ancient world. I really like the background.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think my camera broke a few weeks ago, and I finally got a new one. I think the colors and the camera's working out pretty well. So
yeah, I especially like the transition between yellowish and brownish. It looks really good. I just want to say, for the sake of the audience, that I'm still under the weather, and we'll see how much my throat and my chest allow me because we have so much of the stuff to mention for tonight. So let's start with the cosmic waters. Here we're talking about the relationship of the primordial waters to the cosmic mountain. The cosmologies of the ancient Near East rather consistently portrayed the sacred mountains surrounded by cosmic waters. The cosmic mountain presents the primordial hillock, the place which first emerged from the waters which covered the earth during the creative process. And we already talked about this partially last time. Carey, what is it when it comes to this? When it comes to the very beginning, and us, trying to refresh the memory to the audience when it comes to the previous episode and this, sacred mountain, cosmic mountain, as the place where you want to be rescued and come to dwell. So on the top, you can come and meet the deity.
yeah, well, a lot of people who read Genesis, they're not picturing cosmic mountain language there because it doesn't say anything about a cosmic mountain there. But elsewhere in scripture, we do have mountain imagery associated with Eden. And even though it doesn't specifically say it's a mountain, all of the imagery is there, especially once you get into Eden and you have the 4 rivers that flow from Eden and the garden and things like that. So we're going to be talking about some of that kind of parallel literature from the ancient Near East and comparing it to what we see in the Bible and seeing that they're really describing the same kinds of things. And so we got to kind of picture this in our head while we're doing it. And I think this is also going to help us see a connection between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as well. Because, a lot of people are like, are they 2 creation accounts? Or is Genesis 2 a zooming in of Genesis 1? And I would argue that they are actually chronological in a sense, because of some of this imagery that we'll talk about with the cosmic mountain and sacred space and all of these kinds of ideas. But you definitely get that chaotic imagery of the waters and everything in Genesis 1 when we start out.
Yeah, and it's interesting how when we see this cosmic mountain, that's so it's almost like a refugee place, for people who are being rescued from the chaotic waters, because there's something in waters that would represent that, and that was making the ancient person scared. I mean, not even the ancient person, even nowadays, there's so much from the ocean, especially the ocean floor, that is unexplored. They say it's even more unexplored than the cosmos. So yeah, I'm really interested to learn more about this. Biblical poets utilize the battle imagery to portray Yahweh as a divine warrior who has performed great feats in history. For example, Isaiah 51, Psalm 89, Job 26, Ezekiel 2. In what may be the earliest Israelite poetry, the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, one finds the motif of the battle with the sea and probably the Mount of Heritage, the fruit of the victory over the sea. What is it about this victory? Is God really the divine warrior? And who can be portrayed as his enemy in these couple of first chapters of Genesis?
Yeah, that's another thing that we kind of miss as modern readers. A lot of us do. But when you compare Genesis in its situation in the ancient time and other kinds of literature that they had that idea of the battle of the gods. And that's how creation happened in Babylonian mythology and things like that. And also, you have other related imagery in Egypt and other places as well that is very similar. Now, it seems like you don't have that in Genesis 1. And I would say that you don't, but the imagery is still there. They're going to still be thinking about that because of those presence of the cosmic water, the mention of like um, the sea monsters, in creation and things like that. So the imagery is still going to be there. They're going to still be thinking in terms of this cosmic battle. And so I think that if we have that in our minds as well, we can see how the Bible is really presenting this rich imagery of it without saying that it's really a literal battle between God and somebody else who's going to be able to defeat him, because that's one of the major differences between the Bible and other ancient Near Eastern literature, is that those gods could be defeated, whereas Yahweh cannot. And he demonstrates that time and time again and shows his faithfulness and his ability to follow through on his promises because he cannot be defeated.
Amen. I feel encouraged by that. Thank you. One of the reasons to anticipate the sort of pattern one in fact finds in the epic narratives of creation, deluge, and the sea crossing is this one: through the waters, to the mountain for worship. And these few phrases will be crucial in our episode for tonight. Again, through the waters, to the mountain for worship. And this is a pattern that we can call cultic, so to speak, in as much as it has to do with approaching God, and which thus foreshadows the tabernacle cultus. I know now, Carey, that many people would be almost shocked, as I was years ago when I first heard this from John Walton. Well, how can the Garden of Eden will be even compared to the tabernacle, to the temple, and even cosmos? What? My brain was not, as much as my spirit, they were not able to receive this information as biblical. I was one of those opening the Bible, show me where it says, because I didn't see the patterns, I didn't see the depth. I was just looking for specific verse, and I didn't see this. But how beautiful and crucial for us are these few key aspects. Like, one is approaching the cosmic mountain through the waters, where he's going through so much temptation and hardship. He or she is terrified. There are tentacles of the chaotic monsters. And if you persevere, you come to the top of the mountain where Yahweh is waiting for you in this tabernacle, the cosmic ancient one, where you come to dwell with him forever and ever. What is it that you would like to tell us when it comes to the very introduction of this narrative?
Well, honestly, when I started to learn all of that stuff, there have been several points in my faith journey that the apple cart got really kind of turned over for me, and I started seeing things in a new way. And this wasn't the first one, but it was one of the most essential for me to see this, because it does go through all of scripture and it is in the creation. And because it is in creation, it is in the center of the Pentateuch, where you have Leviticus and all of those supposedly boring laws of sacrifice and things like that. They're not boring once you realize what they mean. Even the creation of the tabernacle, you have that kind of repetitive story in the book of Exodus. And those are kinds of the places you want to skip through and skip over. And I mean, fair enough, sometimes that's just not where your head is going to be at when you're reading. But if you really go back to those chapters and look at them carefully, you can see that creative imagery that reflects the cosmos, that reflects the creation from Genesis. And the whole purpose of what is going on is something that is just so crucial to us, so crucial to why Jesus came, so important to the Christian life today, that this is like, it seems like just this fluffy metaphor that, oh yeah, the Bible uses these kinds of imagery and kind of helps us see this, but let's just move on. But it really is just core to the meaning of everything that's going on with creation and our lives.
Yeah, thanks for that. I want to mention a couple of ancient nearest motives and parallels when it comes to what we see in the Old Testament. For example, Michael Morales explains that the wicked are consigned to the watery abode of the dead. The cosmic waters of Canaanite cosmology not only have their confluence at the mountain of El, but they're also located at the entrance of the watery abode of Mot, who is the goddess of death. Similarly, the Ilurugu, having access to the netherworld, which was the mount of hell, may indicate guilt or innocence by bringing the accused down or not to the netherworld. For example, in Jonah chapter 2, verse 7, may be cited as an explicit biblical parallel, which goes like this: At the roots of the mountains, I descended to the underworld. Its gates were behind me forever. Sheol lies at the roots of the world mountain. Thus, the subterranean waters through which one must pass in the descent to Sheol are identified with the hostile waters of chaos. The victory over menacing death comes from Yahweh, who triumphs over the waters. It is Yahweh who controls these waters. Furthermore, includes his ability to rescue souls from Sheol, or the pit under the waters, like in Psalms 18 and 69. Carey, what a beautiful imagery that Yahweh is the one who comes and rescues you. Even when you're surrounded by waters, like Jonah was when he was in the belly of the beast. What is it about this passage in Jonah 2, and also cross-referencing to the Canaanite mythology that we can say, when it comes to this aspect of the podcast?
Yeah, I think you've mentioned a couple of times just in the short little bit we've already had that there is this idea of testing and trial through the waters. And when you're talking about water, there's different ways you talk about it, right? It either can give life or it can take it away. So water has this kind of dual nature of, we have to have it for survival, but it is also one of the most destructive things. Like, I'm thinking about what's going on right now in, like, around Asheville, North Carolina, with the flooding, and in Tennessee and other places where water can just absolutely decimate a place when it's not what it's supposed to be doing. It's unexpected and people aren't prepared for it. It's killing people in situations where it comes and it's too much. But then you also have the opposite situation where it can also kill people when there's not enough water, when there's no water for the fruitfulness of the land, when there's no water for you to even drink. So, there's this really strange relationship we have with water. And the ancient world, in many, many stories, we have these ideas of like a testing through the water. And this is what happens in the flood, even. Noah is tested by, he has to build the boat. He has to go into the boat. He has to remain faithful to God, that God is going to save him through those waters. And so there's this whole motif that if we follow that and track it through scripture, it goes into places like Jonah, where Jonah is at the depths of the underworld and he's in the belly of the fish. And the imagery just piles and piles on top of itself when you see the water and the underworld and things like that. I think we talked a little bit about the structure of sacred space last time, where we have the entrance into it and you get deeper into it, into this concentric rings, right? And you also have the cosmos that is kind of tiered as well. You have heaven at the top, you have the earth, you have the underworld below the earth, but then you also have the deep. And it can be kind of confusing because it's like, well, is it the deep underground or is it the deep like the ocean? And I don't think it's like we should really be thinking about it that scientifically. But at the same time, you do have deep water under the ground, right? And so, it's like all of these combined things that are going on. And it's, we want to make it all nice and neat and scientific, and it doesn't really work like that. I've seen many suggestions of like, oh, look, science has found this massive underground ocean, and this is what the deep was for the flood. And I mean, I don't want to say there's nothing real, because you do have water that comes from underground. You do have water that can come from multiple directions when you're having a kind of a flood. So yes, there is a literalness about it, but there's also this theme of what does that mean for humanity and our relationship to God, and how can God actually use that to demonstrate his goodness and his mercy and his judgment through what we're doing and what we're dealing with.
Yeah, when I was reading Morales's book, which by the way I provided the Amazon link in the description of the episode, what you said a few minutes ago just reminded me that we as humanity, we have this strange relationship with water. If we lack it, we'll die. If we have the abundance of it, we'll die. And there's this, in a way, there's something scary about water, because in both extremes, your life is in danger. You're gonna perish. So until God comes and either pours out, the floods of, the heavens, so to speak. I mean, the gates of heaven, and through these so-called, windows of heaven, the water comes down and you have water for your community. Otherwise you'll die. And on the other extreme, like you're mentioning, in the floods, if God doesn't come and subdues this water, people will also gonna die unless they're rescued and find refuge on the cosmic mountain. And I like how Sean mentioned recently baptism to communion. Yeah, so there's this imagery from the Old Testament that goes to the New Testament when it comes to waters and baptized. You're baptized through all these temptations through the water, and then you're rescued. And when you're rescued, you're in the presence of the Holy One, and you're granted the seat at the desk for all eternity. And I think it's very beautiful and encouraging. Okay, we're gonna switch from this cosmic waters, a subtopic, to another subtopic that is very important for us, and we named it the gate liturgy. So, for example, in Israel, protecting the sacred space of the temple may have entailed a gate liturgy, as found in Psalm 15, which begins with a question emphatically repeated. Verse 1: Yahweh, who may abide in your tabernacle, who may dwell in your holy mountain. And this is cross reference with Psalm 24:3. Uh, who shall ascend into the mountain of Yahweh, or who shall stand in his holy place? And in Isaiah 33:14, who among us shall dwell with a consuming fire? Who shall us Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? The answer provided by Psalm 15, perhaps recited by the priest guarding the temple precincts, is in verse 2, is the one whoever walks in blamelessness, whoever works righteousness, whoever speaks truth in his heart. This person can ascend to the mountain of Yahweh's abode. Carrie, this may sound a little bit scary and discouraging because who is that person who is so pure, of such a clean heart and clean hands and clean thoughts? I know I'm not. So, what is there to be to encourage a person both in the ancient times and today when it comes to like, hey, I'm holy and I need you to be holy to be in my presence, but you're not holy. So, how would God make us holy and worthy of His presence? Because in our power, we're not to do. Do you think that we can? Because I do think, but of course you can disagree. I think that we can correlate this with the gospel, and I see another very beautiful theme throughout this segment.
Well, we tend to think of righteousness as something that you have to pull out of yourself, and being righteous means that I don't break any laws and I don't do anything wrong. And okay, that would be great if we could live that way. I mean, that's kind of would be our target, right? That's what we should have, that goal for not disobeying and not breaking God's law and things like that. But God also knows that we're human. And so when it's talking about righteous and blameless, that language of blameless is going to remind us of the kinds of animals that they would have in the sacrificial rituals, right? Those were supposed to be perfect. At like they wouldn't have any physical blemishes, they wouldn't have a broken leg. You wouldn't offer up an animal that had some sort of physical problem to it. And so that is kind of this image of this is what we're supposed to, so it's supposed to call us back to that sacrificial temple ritual. We use the word cult here, and it doesn't mean cult as in the way that we usually think about that today. Like a cult is an aberrant set of beliefs where they're trying to force you into what they believe, kind of a situation. That is not what we're talking about here, but rather what we're talking about for cult is it's just a technical term that is anything involved with the temple rituals. And so, it's that formalized kind of worship and situations like that. So when we are supposed to be held as righteous, it means that we are following along with what we're supposed to do regarding what we're supposed to do. When you do something wrong, what do you do then? When you find out that you have wronged someone, what do? Do you deny that you did that? Or do you work to fix it, and work to fix it in the ways that God has set up? And so there's this whole idea of, again, seeing how the temple ritual and the tabernacle was supposed to bring the people into God's presence. And so when you do something, then there is forgiveness to be had when you actually go out and make restitution, when you're actually trying to follow God's law and live in a way that God can live with you with his presence, right? So it's kind of a complex, different thing for us today because we are so just not in that context of ritual and this type of sacrifice in thinking about it in the terms that they did. And I mean, that's a whole other topic itself, is talking about what sacrifice is and how it makes you righteous, how it's connected to being righteous. But at minimum, what we can say is that it is involved in this whole thing of having God's presence with you. And how are you going to help that to happen? Are you working towards that situation where you can have God's presence? Or do you just want to go and do your own thing and you don't care about God's presence?
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, for those who don't know, the Garden of Eden was located on a mountain, and this imagery of the cosmic mountain, which we really spent a lot of time in the previous episode, had so much had resemblance to the ancient temple or the tabernacle. the way they were orchestrating, having people as priests, having sacred space guardians, but also having gates. So as an archetypal temple, this cosmic mountain also has gates, bearing entrance along the pathway of ascent to the divine abode, so that a ritual gate or entrance liturgy becomes an anticipated possibility in narratives informed by a cosmic mountain ideology. The gate liturgy has to do with stipulations for who may enter the sacred space of a temple. And that makes sense because if it's sacred space, God wants to protect it, just in the same way when he banished Adam and Eve, he put guardian cherubim to protect the sacred space. So, somewhat similar to the entrance liturgies in biblical literature are the inscriptions engraved on side doors leading into the temples of Greco Roman Egypt, such as found at the Temple of Edfu, which reads like this: Do not initiate wrongfully. Do not enter when unclean. Do not utter falsehood in his house. Do not covet the property of his temple. Do not tell lies. Do not receive bribes. Do not discriminate between the poor and the great. Do not add to the weight of the measuring cord, but rather reduce them. Do not tamper with corn measure. Dr. Griffiths compares another such inscription, which contrasts the one who speaks falsehood in thy house with the one who is pure, he who is upright and walks in the path of righteousness, with the contrast paths of Psalm 1. So this is another parallel that we see between the ancient Near East and the Old Testament. And honestly, it just makes me glad to see that there's so much culture and historical parallels in the pagan literature, and their narratives, which we can see how the Old Testament and the whole Bible didn't just appear out of blue in this vacuum, but no, it was being written and existed in a real time and place, where so many events were taking place, where Israel and the Hebrews were witnessing so much of the idolatry, spiritual warfare, being imprisoned and going to slavery. And now we can see one of many parallels between the Bible and the ancient narratives. So I want to ask you, what is it about this narrative in Egypt and the Temple of Edfu? We see all these requirements, Carey, that you're supposed to do if you want to be clean, to enter into the presence of their deity, versus in the Bible, especially Psalm 1, what you're supposed to do and how to be clean.
Yeah. Well, we do see it's interesting because you have these parallels, and a lot of people will say, well, it means that the Bible was just copied from other sources and they stole these ideas. But really, when you've got the perspective that the Bible is presenting God and his working out with human history, right? We actually have God doing things in history. And so it's not that these other things that the Bible has stolen from these other places and things. It's that they have twisted the ideas that are presented and true from the actual presentation that we have in the Bible, and then saying, well, we're going to use it for our own purposes, and we're going to say that it is this or that or the other thing, right? It's like the same thing with idolatry, and how idolatry isn't just something that people made up, but rather it's a twisting of the image of God in its true form, which is humanity. And so you have that's really what you have going on with all of these different ideas. And it shouldn't surprise us. It shouldn't shock us that there's similarities, and that there's parallels, and that you can see kind of the same kinds of meanings in all of these places. But the entrance, the whole idea of entrance is fascinating to me. I actually was just talking about this on my podcast a few weeks ago, about how I remember thinking, as I was reading through Genesis, you have a lot of instances where things happen at thresholds. And I thought, why does that matter? Why is it at a threshold? It's just like some sort of interesting detail, or why is that important to note? And at the time, this was fairly early in my studies of biblical theology, and the person I was studying with in some sort of, it was just a Sunday school class or something, they were kind of tracking along with me, this idea that you could study the Bible in context and there was more meaning to it than we really understood when we're just reading it from our English Bibles in our context today. So I asked my teacher, I said, why is there so many thresholds? And he said, well, it's just because that's happened to be where they were when this happened. I said, okay, that doesn't make any sense, because the Bible doesn't have detail just for the sake of detail. Everything in there has some sort of meaning, or it would have an association in the minds of the ancient person with something essential. And so eventually I realized it has to do with like the threshold of sacred space, right? So if you had a house, this would, in the book of Genesis, we don't have the tabernacle yet. We don't have the temple. We do have altars and mountains and high places, things like that. But people's homes were also, in a sense, some sort of sacred spot. And so a threshold would be a boundary line between the outside and the inside of your home. And you would treat the outside of your home differently than you treat the inside of your home. Just like in sacred space, you treat the inside of sacred space as holy because it is the place for God, and the outside of sacred place or sacred space is something that you would not have holy things, or holy things could potentially be defiled by unclean things, by profane things. And so you have this distinction between holy and profane. And it's not that profane has to be bad, it just means it's common. It means it's not sacred. It means it's not for that special use in the sacred space. And that distinction is going to help the people understand who they are in relation to God, because God is so much other than we are. And so this is kind of an object lesson that some of my teachers would say this is an object lesson to show who God was compared to humanity, right? So
Yeah, thanks for that. By the way, I want to thank everyone in the live chat, especially in the last few minutes, Christian Fernandez with his very thoughtful book titles that he recommended, and some of the ancient uh, links and parallels, and something regarding the architecture. So I'll just encourage the audience to read his comments.
yeah, well,
Um,
I just want to say I'm really appreciating those comments too. And I think he's right that art is a kind of language that really communicates. And I think that sometimes we miss that when it's like, well, that's just figurative. Nothing is just figurative. That's something that is there for a meaning. And it's, if it's there in an artistic sense, it might be there in even broader sense than it would be if it was just stated outright.
Yeah, as we were mentioning, guarding this space because it has gates, and it's not just gates because it has protectors, and these are usually divine or semi-divine beings, both in the Bible and in the ancient Near East narratives. So, for example, protecting the divine abode from profanation was the function common throughout the ancient Near East of the temple door guardians, cherubim in the Bible. Then we have Lamassu, lion, genie in different mythologies of the world, and eventually performed by the priests. Wow. So I don't know about the ancient mythologies. I don't know that much, but eventually we see in the Bible that what cherubim were doing, the Jewish priests overtook that role when it comes to the rest of the Old Testament. What is it there to be said when we make such a parallel?
Well, it's fascinating because priests are also very much like the image of God, kind of the idol of a pagan temple. So a pagan temple would have the idol of a deity, and that idol would supposedly be indwelt by the spirit of their deity, right? They'd have a ceremony in which, after the building of the temple and the dedication of the temple, they could then install the pagan idol. Well, of course, the Israelite tabernacle had no idol, because that would be idolatrous, right? That's why they weren't supposed to have those images. It's not because they were against decoration, because they had plenty of decoration. They had flowers and palm trees and cherubim, even in the on the veil that separated the holy space from the holy of holies. And so it wasn't that images were bad, it was that they couldn't do anything that was like a pagan temple that had an idol, because the Israelite tabernacle or temple had the true image of God, which was a real human. Not that the human was being worshipped, but the human was being God's representative. And so we do have cherubim in, again, like I said, with the tabernacle and the temple, but you're right, it's that the priest is supposed to be the literal guardian and the one who's keeping the sacred space sacred, doing all of the things that they were supposed to do, keeping all of the laws so that, and cleaning it so that it could be used for the purposes that it was designed to be used for.
Yeah, good point. Because priests in the Old Testament times also had to be butchers, so it was a bloody job, most literally, and it was their job to make everything and everyone holy. And if you're not holy, if by any certain means you broke any of the rules and you're impure, not that you were put to death, unless you did something horrible willingly, but then you have to go through the ritual process to become clean, and then you're welcome again. So, Carrie, an additional way of protecting sacred space from profanation in the ancient Near East was via the ritual lustrations. And I had to Google what is the word lustration. So, for the sake of audience, everyone like me who didn't know what the word means, lustration is the performance of lustrum, which is a ceremony of purification and of averting evil. Okay. So, that being said, uh, so this was a way of protecting sacred space from profanation in the ancient Near East via the ritual illustrations, by which the worshipper could wash his hands in innocence. And we see this in the ancient Near East narratives. We see this in the Bible, for example, in Psalm 26:6, then 24:4, 73:13. This was another way of purifying yourself before you come into the presence of the Lord. So we see that, again, I don't know when it comes to all the ancient Near East mythologies, but we see this at least in the Bible, that stepping into the sacred space was a serious business. If you're not holy, better do not come into God's presence, because He's holy and He loves you, of course, but do not play with His holiness. Be washed, so to speak, in God, in His Spirit, in His purity, and then approach Him. Is this something that, in your understanding, should be encouraging to the believer? Because so many rituals, so many commandments, like you said earlier, when we read, in Torah, some of the commandments, they may seem boring to us or meaningless, but actually they all have meaning. So when we see all these commandments when it comes to ritual purity, and when we see how God takes His holy space so seriously, how can we encourage today's person who is not under the under the old covenant, yet is still called to be holy, to be in God's presence? What is it there, so we can encourage people who are serving Yahweh under the new covenant?
Yeah, well, we still have ideas of washing, right? And this ideas of you need to be presentable in the situation that you're in. So this shouldn't be too difficult for us to grasp. But for a lot of Protestants, it's like, well, we don't want to see sacred space as something special. So it's interesting, because a lot of Protestant churches can go out of their way. Sometimes they don't do any decorating. They don't want a pretty building at all because they're concerned that it would be too much like that Old Testament context where they would have the beautiful tabernacle or the beautiful temple and things like that. But I think that we've already mentioned baptism, right? And a lot of us, I think that baptism just started in the New Testament, but really it has very old connotations that go back to all of this. You know, we tend to think, oh, Jesus was all about sacrifice, and so we read Leviticus and we just focus on those what we think are bloody rituals because we're not used to slaughtering animals every day in our day-to-day lives, and so to us that seems strange. But there were a lot of washing rituals, a lot of washing rituals, and they had different meanings, different intentions for them. And so again, we have this idea of the chaos waters being dangerous, but waters under control and used for a proper use are going to bring life. And so that's part of this whole idea of that dualistic nature of water. And it's not like it's a magical ritual. It's not like it magically did something. Because if something magically happens, it's inherent to the property itself, right? And that's not anything that we see in scripture. The sacrifices weren't magic. They didn't force God to do anything. God was already willing and present with the people. But what they did was give this participation between human and God in what God already was doing. So you couldn't perform some ritual and then say, well, that is going to make God do something. That's not how that works because it's not that kind of magic. It's just this ritual that allows us to see a very embodied participation with God, is how I would put it. And yeah, this is a good comment. If you take seriously the temple theology, churches need specific typological design. Temples were a cosmological model, not theaters. I love that. Yeah, I think that it shouldn't scare us to think that we can have a design because we live our lives in ways that we have more ritual to our lives than we realize. And we set up our lives in ways that kind of help that to happen. And so we shouldn't be afraid of thinking of our churches as a sort of sacred space. Not that God isn't present and can't be present everywhere, but you're doing something special when you go and you partake of the Lord's table, right? You don't do that anywhere. I mean, you can, but this is that community moment where you're in your congregation. And so all of the design of the building could in theory help to give that meaning and to what you're doing. Like if you're doing a baptism, a lot of people will still go and do it in a river, and there's symbolism to doing it in a river because river is, it's moving water, and to the ancient mind, moving water would be like the water of life. Stagnant water would not be something you'd want to drink if it was sitting there for a long time. It could have stuff in it growing that's going to make you sick. Whereas moving water is got this connotation or this idea of freshness. Like I don't suggest you go and drink from a mountain stream. Okay, you're still going to get sick, but there's that idea of stagnant water versus moving water, which is the movement is something that's alive.
When you're talking about this, I try to imagine I'm present in someone's baptism, and as the water is moving, the sin is leaving the person and moving further down. And I just my mind instantly made uh, parallel with when they were sending two goats and one went to Azazel. So the point was for sin to leave the camp because nothing unholy can be in God's presence. So in someone's baptism, so to speak, metaphorically, like in the running water, the sins will be taken away from you, and I think it's beautiful. Um, so The same as we did in the first segment of the podcast, which we named the Cosmic Waters, and now in the Gate Liturgy, there's so much to say. We had to skip so much of the material that Michael Morales covered. Some of that we'll cover in our last segment, which is coming. I just want to say that for the sake of time, we can't do everything, but these are wonderful and beautiful and very important aspects. But as the last question, when it comes to the Gate Liturgy for now, before we switch to the last biggest segment, would be this one. While the wicked are judged via the waters and consigned to Sheol, the righteous are brought safely through the waters of the Mount of the Divine Presence. And this reminds me when we were talking how waters can be in extremes. If they're lacking or if there's abundance of them, they can be they can breathe death, right? So you can drown in them, or because if there's no water and you're missing water, you'll also die, right? And on the other hand, the water can be a water of salvation, like in the case of Noah, or like in the case of the New Testament, and when we're doing baptism. So in the first case, when it's too extreme and the wicked are judged, if they are not submitted to the authority of Yahweh and yielding to His will and to His Spirit, they're consigned to Sheol. But the righteous are used by the same water that brings death to some. They're using the same water to bring life, so they can be transported, so to speak, to this mountain. And on the mountain, there is God, Yahweh, who is waiting for them after all those trials to welcome them. And now they're dwelling in His presence forever and ever. And I think it's a beautiful picture of the eschaton and of what will wait for us in Christ one day. So, what is it that you would like to say about this?
Yes, I think that everything that you just said is awesome and right. But I also think there's a sense in which that's still true today. And I think that was what blew my mind the most the first time I got into Michael Morales's work, is learning about how the whole temple and tabernacle and all of the system there was so that God could dwell with the people. And so that's all associated with the Exodus. And we, of course, we have the going through the waters of the people. And there's a very obvious judgment there when Pharaoh tries to go through those same waters and he and his people do not make it through. So, and of course, like just like with the flood, Noah made it and the other people did not. And so there's that judgment factor. And part of me wonders, as you think about those kinds of things, how baptism relates to that, because as we're going through our baptism, it's not just the fact that we are being baptized, it's the fact that Jesus was first baptized and we are baptized in his death. And so that this is also another symbol, or a metaphor, a picture of what's going on. Going into the water is like going into death. Being brought out of the water is coming into life. So there's that whole picture of resurrection and things like that. And this is, oh, nice. Can you put that quote up so we can read it? Yeah, the fact that there is a distinction between salt waters of the sea and fresh waters of the rivers is reflected in the second and third trumpets in Revelation 8 through 10, and the second and third bowls in Revelation 16, 4 through 7. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. See, like it's these awesome pictures that we see from Genesis through Leviticus, through the whole Torah, through what we see in Jesus, the Gospels, even into Revelation and what we see in the end times. And so I love that picture of the already but not yet. So we have it in the eschaton, and that's when we're going to have the complete picture and the culmination of it. But also, that doesn't discount that we are living it out today, and that is part of our lives in the church. Ooh, here's another one. I'll read this one too. Save your voice. Byzantium perfected the adaptation of church design to bridge Bible and Roman architecture. Renaissance muddled everything, and the reformers were right in calling out the overreach. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I think that sometimes, and I've done a little survey of sacred space through the church. It's an absolutely fascinating thing. And you can land on different arguments for that, right? Some people will still say that we shouldn't have an overly fancy sacred space, and that trying to go back to that kind of overly fancy thing is not what we should do in the church today. And then others who will say that it's actually that continuation from the Old Testament to today. And I think that you have arguments for both sides in different ways, but you shouldn't just toss out one of these ideas without looking at it and seeing the value and beauty of what the actual design and things that we can bring to art in our spaces. Like, I've even seen, it reminds me of, have you seen those pictures of some pulpits that are like the Jonah's whale, and the preacher is supposed to be up preaching from the whale? Like, that's amazing.
Yeah, when I was, I don't know, when I became a evangelical believer about 25 years ago, I was taught that, there's no reason for us to have crosses and imageries and frescoes and icons, because it can be abused, it can become idolatry. But as more as I'm studying into the history of the church and Old Testament and New Testament of biblical theology, and I see these symbols and pictures, and back at Moody, we learned that in the beginning of the Christian church, for many, many centuries, so many people were not educated. So these pictures and frescoes were serving to explain the gospel. And now that you're mentioning this is the pulpit with, how, you were standing on the place of the whale and Jonah. Now I'm thinking that, yes, it will be more interesting and in a way beautiful, and certainly not sinful, if we will start introducing some of the stuff that Orthodox, Anglican, and Catholic churches have. Maybe not everything, but something that would be, when we enter the church, it wouldn't be just ACs blowing, light effects, coming at you like you're in a concert, but actually there's certain imagery when you see, like, wow, I'm stepping into a sacred space. I'm stepping into something that is different than the outside. And of course, it's because we serve God, so His Spirit is among us wherever we are at, of course. But also, it will be, I think, it will bring to the atmosphere if our walls and our windows will be decorated like we see in the old churches and cathedrals. Yeah, I think we're losing by avoiding this and putting everything like, oh, it can be sinful. It can be, I guess, but not everything is sinful. So I guess that's another topic. Carrie, we left this last topic because it's the biggest one for the end, and we named it the creation account. So now what we'll be talking about the cosmic mountain, about escaping these chaotic waters, trying to enter the gate, which is guarded by the sacred space guardians. Now we're gonna dissect this when it comes to the Genesis 1 and 2, and we'll be talking about stuff that we mentioned, but in depth, and also we'll be mentioning some other stuff. So when it comes to the creation account, there are these keywords and key aspects, patterns, which we mentioned at the beginning, three things. So one goes through the waters to climb to the mountain where he or she comes to worship the deity, and in our case is Yahweh. So again, we will be dealing with these three patterns for the rest of the episode. So let's start with Genesis 1. Genesis 1, verse 2 may be read as key to understanding the nature of the waters surrounding the cosmic mountain, through which one crosses to approach the divine abode. God's division of those waters may also be understood as determinative for his judicial role in relation to them. The abundant life in the divine presence narrated in Genesis 2 would explain humanity's need to approach the mountain of God, and the expulsion narrative of Genesis 3 to justify the tabernacle cultus as the divinely revealed means for that approach. In other words, Israel's cosmic mountain ideology may be rooted in the opening of its canon. Via cosmic mountain ideology, we will consider three things: the creation waters as an ordeal, the sanctuary symbolism in the creation accounts, and the worship as the telos, or the meaning, the end of creation, including how the expulsion narrative determines, that is, comprises the backdrop to the gate liturgy. So out of these three things, let's deal first with the first one. Through the waters, the creation as water ordeal. Genesis 1:2, which we just mentioned, emphasized that the primordial waters of the deep prevailed over the earth or land, making it as a weltering wasteland. The earth was delivered from the primeval waters. Uh, I'll stop for now because there's so much text. What is it that you would like to comment on this, especially to the last part that is related to Genesis 1?
Yeah, see, part of what I often come up with when I'm talking to people about the cosmic temple idea, and it's something that they're not familiar with, they kind of are shocked by it, right? Because many people have only thought about Genesis 1 in this literal scientific sense of this is what it looked like for God to create. First, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and so on. And so they're seeing it as the sequence of events documenting what God did to create. And it's not that you can't read it like that, but what you're missing when you read it like that are these kinds of imagery that really set up the rest of Scripture. Because if you see what God is doing in Genesis 1 as this ordering of creation, as this forming of the cosmos in an ordered way to create the cosmic temple, and the day 7 is the day of rest where God enters into creation to dwell with us, then suddenly it's not like the first 6 days of creation are things that God did, and the 7th day he wasn't doing anything, but rather the 6 days are what he does in order to build up to that 7th day. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into more about this narrative with the Sabbath and all of these things. But that's what even the first couple of verses in Genesis 1 is actually presenting. And again, it's not that you can't imagine it as step-by-step things if you want, if that, kind of helps you to picture it, then great. But it's really essential to see what these core images are as there's something going on that is inhospitable to life. We cannot live in creation as it is in the way that it starts out. Creation has to proceed forward in order to make the world livable for us. And that is kind of what God is doing. And he's doing this in a step-by-step way. And the way that the ancient person would parallel that with is not some like mental movie of creation, but rather, hey, he's setting up a divine abode for himself with us in the middle of it, which that's really cool if you think about it.
Yeah, it is. It is. Before we continue with this segment, I just want to invite everyone to please check out Carey's podcast. I provided a link in the video description. Subscribe, support in that way her work. Also, please do it with this channel. We are close to get 1,000 subscribers. I'm hoping within a month or two. So it doesn't cost you anything. I would really appreciate if you support both of Carey's and this podcast. So, as this creation account narrative that we're covering, and we're starting as Genesis 1, especially verses 2, again, we're going through first of the three patterns, through the waters. And in this narrative, through the waters, we have a couple of different important segments. So, we will now consider God's role in creation as a water controller and how, via that control, the earth's creation is portrayed as being delivered from the waters. So, when it comes to God as the water controller, we can say that water is symbolic of death. When it is uncontrolled, too much or too little, and life, when is it controlled because it produces growth and fertility, and we already talked about this. This statement summarizes the movement from Genesis 1:2 to Genesis 2:10-14, from the chaotic waters to the dark abyss, to the fructifying rivers of Eden, either spirit or wind of God, or both. particularly in light of the role of the word used for spirit wind in the deluge and in the sea crossing, express God's control over the waters. The portrait here of divine water wielder is coherent with that of Genesis 2, where God is identified as the causer of rain, who is also in charge of the rain. Such an idea, God as water controller, has parallels in the ancient Near East narratives such as Enuma Elish. So, Carey, again, we see here God is sovereign over the nature, sovereign over the cosmos, and any potential, I won't say necessarily enemies, but disasters or threats to human life, not to God, because there is nothing that can threaten life. And we see here God as completely in control over everything. When we read certain passages of Genesis, we may see, oh, like this is it. There is no help for the humankind. But then God comes and He calms down what is happening. The same way Jesus was acting in Genesis when He was calming down the wind and the sea. What is it when it comes to the spirit or wind of God that is being able to control waters? What is this telling us? I know we may even use a little bit of systematic theology. What is this telling us about God who we serve?
Yeah, well, I think that we can actually see, people want to see the Trinity in Genesis 1, and sometimes they try and use verses like Genesis 1:26 to get there, but really you can see the Trinity early on in the first chapter of Genesis, because we have the Word, the Logos of God, acting, and we have the Spirit of God actually moving over the waters. And the image there, that as it describes, is like a bird hovering over its nest or something like that. And yet these waters are chaotic, they're dangerous, they're not a place that we can live. These are not the waters that are going to sustain our lives. And so we have the Spirit there who is acting in a way to create an environment where we will be able to be flourishing humans. And so I think that is a really beautiful picture of God's care, because we do see the Spirit actively working through the Old Testament. We certainly see it in the New Testament, and we see it with the day of Pentecost. We see it actively in our churches. We can have the Spirit indwelling in us. It's something that is associated with Jesus's baptism, all of these pictures. And so that it's really this core imagery of God caring for us in this really deep kind of a way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just to add on what you said is another thought from Morales. Through divine control of waters of chaos, the waters of chaos becomes waters of life. And I like this, how any any threat to human life, God can use this and change the purpose so it can actually be a blessing to us. It's just amazing. So at the center of the creation narrative in Genesis 2 lies the description of the four rivers which flowed from the Garden of Eden. For paradise, the dwelling of God, to be the source of life-giving waters, is moreover in keeping with general Mesopotamian thought. But I would like you to say something on this following. The scholar J.M. Lundquist said that the temple is often associated with the waters of life which flow forth from a spring within the building itself. Or rather, the temple is viewed as incorporating within itself or as having been built upon such a spring. The reason such springs exist in temples is that they are perceived as the primeval waters of creation, Nun in Egypt, Abzu in Mesopotamia, and so forth. The temple is thus founded on and stands in contact with the primeval waters. So, and we'll talk about this also later, but we see that the ancient temple, not just in Mesopotamian thought, but also and primarily in the case of the ancient, Jewish monotheism and Yahweh, God and His presence in this certain place are the only reason why the chaos is being controlled and why is it not coming to kill the humanity, because God is able to subdue it so that people can flourish, and life can be spread throughout the earth. And God is doing this for our good. He doesn't need to multiply, he doesn't need to eat, he doesn't need oxygen, he doesn't need any of this, as someone who is eternal and is the spirit. So how wonderful is that God's control and sovereignty in this case works so well for humankind, and for us to be to flourish and to spread.
Yeah, well, I love how it's both a picture of the source of those chaotic waters that God has full control over, and that is actually stemming from his sacred space, versus and he's making those waters into life-giving streams for humanity. And there's the four rivers of Eden and the streams that come from the temple, and there's four of them because there's four corners of the earth, so to speak, right? So it's going out into the whole world. So again, just because they had the idea of sacred space in one place, whether it was the tabernacle or the temple or the top of a mountain, there was still an idea that what was going on there was supposed to reach all of humanity. It was supposed to go out into the whole world. So the idea of the Spirit being anywhere is not just a New Testament church idea. It was also an Old Testament idea. That's why all of creation is the cosmic temple and not just a location. That was what it was meant to be from the beginning. So again, and that again kind of helps me when I'm thinking about my own sacred space in church or something, to not get too pedantic about that and be too legalistic about it. Like, we can't have a church sacred space because the world is supposed to be a sacred space. Well, the Israelites had a tabernacle and a temple, and that didn't prevent God from being everywhere. It didn't prevent the idea that God was supposed to be everywhere. The idea of God choosing the nation of Israel was so that the world would be blessed and all of these things. So it doesn't have to be an either or kind of a thing. The very existence of the temple presumes that it would benefit and go out to the entire world. And so I think that can be really helpful for us in our church contexts as we can meet together in sacred, special places, but not say that it has to be all only there as well. And so the idea of chaos waters versus life-giving waters also can help us kind of see that parallel, where we have even streams will go into the ocean, and streams will do what they do in regards to what the ocean has, and it's not that there's that, I want to say, kind of imagery of safety when we think about what God is supposed to do in relation to wherever we are, right? And so going out into those chaotic waters, we would still be safe. And it's because of God's presence. And it was never meant to be that God's presence was locked up into one place. It was just that this was the imagery and the way that people could have those places for their ritual and symbolic offerings, things like that, so that they could understand that relationship between God and humanity.
Thanks for that. When it comes to the creation is the earth's deliverance, there are only a couple of things I would like to mention, and you can comment on any of these things that you would like. Correlated with the transformation of the waters of chaos into waters of life, their control by God leads to the deliverance of the earth, an event in view already in Genesis 1:2, when the earth is described as a weltering wasteland, deluged in the watery abyss. This idea is in keeping with the judicial water ordeal paradigm whereby the deity delivers the righteous or innocent through the waters of judgment. I don't know, is there anything you'd like to say on this before I skip to the second part?
I think we kind of covered a little bit of that earlier, talking about the Exodus, talking about the flood, and we can even see how that kind of can enter into our ideas of baptism as well. Not that, you're going to be judged and you're not going to make it through the baptism, because again, this is connected to Jesus's death, which was the ultimate victory of things.
Yeah, and the second thing is that when it comes to the creation, is the earth's deliverance, is that the earth's being drawn out of the waters contribute to the idea of the birth of the cosmos. And even the earth itself appears to be described in terms of a womb. Being delivered from the waters by God's control, the earth is then called to sprout vegetation and fruit bearing trees in prospect of the corresponding sixth day. So then it is the Spirit who brings life through the watery womb, so to speak, out of the darkness and abyss. Um, Carrie, again, this is, I don't know if some people would think this is a little bit controversial, like show me where the word womb is, but I think we can see this, that God is using something that was dead, just in the case of women who couldn't give birth throughout the Bible, and now life comes, because where the Spirit of God comes, life comes. And I think this is beautiful for us to see how God was able to turn death into life.
Yeah. So, what this reminds me of, I know that when we're talking about Genesis 1:26 and the whole "let us make" imagery, or words there, the grammar, that is plural, and yet only God is the one who creates. And I think that the strongest interpretation of that verse is that it is God who is addressing his holy divine council, who are they're not doing anything, they're just present in creation. And because God's spiritual family were created before he created the human family, us, us as the image of God, it means that God had a heavenly family that he was speaking to. It's not that we are in the image of the heavenly host, it's that we are in the image of God, and the heavenly host are also in the image of God. So we're all in the image of God. We're not in the image of lower beings. But so I think that's the best interpretation. But there is an older Jewish interpretation that it is God who is addressing the earth. And so in this case, it would be the earth who is participating in some sense, not as like a conscious being, but in kind of this participation with God in creating mankind. Because once you get to Genesis 2, Adam is made out of the dirt, right? Which is from the earth. And so there's this Jewish interpretation that, you know, the earth is playing a role in participating with God in creation. And as you said, the earth is bringing forth the vegetation, not because the earth is a conscious, like Mother Earth kind of an idea. It's like, it's not that. It's not this pagan notion, but it's this idea that God participates and uses creation in order to continue his creative purposes, right? So that's just an interesting kind of side note, alternative uh, interpretation for that verse. I think it's more of I don't even think it's particularly an early Jewish interpretation. I think it came about in the Middle Ages or so. But it's really interesting because of that idea of the womb of the earth, and the fact that we could think of the grave as being, when Jesus died, he went into the womb of the earth and came out, and so this idea of rebirth and recreation is kind of wrapped up in that. Again, it's not some sort of crazy woo pagan notion of the earth actually being a deity, but the imagery of that is really something that has strong connotations in the early church, especially.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you especially emphasizing for those people who are I don't know, super sensitive that we're not introducing any new age ideas. And Morales stated the same in his book. So, for those who've been paying attention in this last segment, the longest one, the three key patterns again are through the waters, which is the one that we just mentioned. For the righteous one, God will able to put him, to go with them through the waters and to rescue them. But for those who keep being unfaithful, who don't want to be with covenant with Yahweh, these waters are leading to Sheol, so which is not right, which is not good. But the righteous are rescued. So we're switching now from that first pattern of through the waters to maybe a little bit more exciting one where the one who manages to go through these waters of temptations and struggles of life and sin and temptations and whatnot, he or she now comes to the mountains. So this is the second key aspect in this last segment, which we name to the mountain for worship, to dwell in the divine presence. Eden may be seen as the archetypal cosmic mountain. Temples were architectural representations of the cosmic mountain because mountains were the original temples in the ancient Near East. Cosmic mountain ideology is at the root of sanctuary motifs. The presence of a mountain in a narrative, even serving as something of a clue that temple motifs are likely present. Genesis 1 depicts creation as a cosmic mountain, while Genesis 2 presents the Garden of Eden as a holy of holies atop of this paradisical mountain and describes humanity as a priesthood. So now let's deal again with Genesis 1 and then we'll switch to Genesis 2. When it comes to Genesis 1, in the ancient Near East, the temple was thought to be the center and mainstay of creation. Temples were built for the purpose of divine rest. Moreover, the 7-day sequence of creation being the common ancient Near East period for temple building dedication has also led scholars to recognize that creation in Genesis 1 uses the language of temple building. Again, when I was first introduced to this by John Walton several years ago, I was thinking that he's way off with his theology. Where in the world is this in the Bible, especially in the Genesis, until I start seeing more and more from other scholars. So, Carey, what is it about Genesis 1, ancient Near East, that garden represented the first temple where humanity and God, and in our case, Yahweh, were supposed to have this divine rest, divine communion with each other, and how can we even see that the garden represented temple?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we have the idea that the 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 cosmic temple is being established in Genesis 1, right? We have the cosmic temple as all of creation. And yet we have Eden also as a temple kind of imagery as well. And it's not just even Eden. We have Eden as having concentric zones as well. You have Eden, you have the Garden of Eden, which is not all of Eden. So once you start imagining these concentric rings of creation and sacred space, both kind of demonstrating the same kind of a thing, you have the cosmic mountain as God's throne room kind of a thing. And so we have these ideas, and it's not an either or. It's not either that we have the cosmic temple in general in Genesis 1, or we have the cosmic space or the sacred space in Genesis 2. It's both things are going on there. And as we talk more about humanity as priests, I think that's going to be kind of a really essential aspect to what we're looking at here. And I have to say, it's also interesting when I bring this up because people who are afraid that Christians are going to go to the narrative of evolution, they're worried that people bring up the idea of the cosmic temple to go down the path of evolution. And I think that John Walton actually does go down that path himself, which is fine, but it's not necessary. Just because John Walton goes and talks about evolution doesn't mean we then have to. The point of this isn't to go down any particular scientific path, right? So that's one of the things I like to try and bring out into the conversation, that it doesn't have to mean that we're taking some scientific side here. What we're doing is we're trying to situate ourselves in the ancient mind and see the world in the way that they saw it.
Yeah, thanks for that. The creation account presents God as a workman or artificer who builds, inspects, pronounces on his work, and then takes his Sabbath rest. Scholar W.A. Gage said that the Old Testament has descriptions of creation as a tabernacle which God has pitched, cross-referencing Psalm 104, Job 9:8, and Isaiah 40:22, or a house which God has established with pillars, windows, and doors in Job 26:11, Genesis 7:11, or Psalm 78:23. Consequently, the Temple of Zion, as a sanctuary which God has established, becomes a microcosmic metaphor for creation itself. I love this. So, the Temple of Zion, once again, as a sanctuary which God has established, becomes a microcosmic metaphor for creation itself. This idea finds explicit expression in Psalm 78:69, which says, "And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has founded forever." The vast majority scholars recognize this liturgical character of the creation narrative. The Sabbath is called the cosmic liturgy of the seventh day. The repetitive nature of the creation account is suggestive of a liturgy, its majesty and rhythm possessing a liturgical cadence greater than the sum of its parts. Carey, there's some scholars who, when they observe Genesis 1, maybe even 2, they say it has poetic way that it could have been written. Not necessarily, but it does have. There are all these repetitive, words. For example, how every day begins and then ends. And again, we see this imagery of the beginning of this place where humans are about to be made of as a sanctuary and as a safe place where God would dwell with them, and they're safe from these cosmic waters, and God is coming to pitch his tabernacle. And that's funny, I didn't even mention to say this, but we see the same thing in John 1, where Jesus is coming to literally tabernacle with his people. Same thing, right? Since the beginning, God wanted to spend time with us. And again, we did see this imagery with the tabernacle, because how it would look like, how it would be established, and all of these things. And then we see that Sabbath is being introduced as a liturgical character. So there is this cosmic liturgy of the seventh day. So again, like a poem, we see the creation, and then finally everything stops. The seventh day enters, where God and humans can rest. And I know there are Christians, but even more non-Christians, who sometimes may mock and say, well, what kind of deity needs to rest? But this is not rest like God was tired from his work. He actually stops from work as a pattern to give humans pattern to rest from their work and enter into this more intimate time with him. So it's not for those who, like Adventists, who want to abuse passages about Sabbath to be something so legalistic, which we'll cover next Sunday in our episode on modern day Judaizers and legalism. It's rather they're like, check out Genesis 1 like a poem, and we enter into this final day of rest from everything, and now enjoy the presence of the Lord. Carey, how much more beautiful is this, to come and rest from your work, rest from your burdens, come into Jesus' presence and rest versus, hey, you better not work anything on the seventh day, or you're gonna sin and you're not entering heaven. Which we may see from those legalistic churches. I see two way more different narratives, way two more different exegesis of these passages in Genesis.
Oh, I definitely agree. And it's fascinating, again, to me to see people who go to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because it kind of, doesn't end in Genesis 1 fully. And then they go to Exodus 20, to the Decalogue, to the Ten Commandments, and say, look, it's got to be literal because of this. But they miss the fact that it's so deeply, deeply liturgical, because a lot of our churches have not done a very good job in teaching the importance of liturgy. And even if you're in a low liturgical church, chances are you have some sort of liturgy. It just means you have like a pattern of what you're doing in order to worship, right? You have a pattern for your Sunday worship. You have a pattern where you do this and you do this, you do this. You have a structure in some sense of where people are going to sit and how appropriate it is that you do this or that or the other thing. That is part of liturgy. And of course there's higher liturgy that has a deeper understanding and more ritualistic patterns to what they're doing. And the lower liturgical people will look at that sometimes and say, well, hey, you guys are all being legalistic. And the question is, maybe they are, because that's kind of a heart motivation of legalism, right? Why are you doing what you're doing? Are you doing it because it's the law and, well, I'm required to do it? Or are you doing it because you see that deeper meaning of God being with us? And that's the message to be taking away here, is God's presence. And yeah, it's stated in this way of patterned after our human week and the divine week are both patterned. They're both parallel to one another, right? They both have the same thing. But that doesn't mean that we're going to do on Monday the same thing that God did on that certain day of the creation week. That's not what it means. It means that we see what God is doing, and he is coming and tabernacling with us. And this is one of the core aspects of why I think no matter what would happen in the garden, Jesus still would have come to tabernacle with us, because that is God's heart. That is that is the teleos of creation and the purpose of why God made us, in order to come down and be with us and join with humanity and bring us into his presence. And so we have worship, we have liturgy, and we've been talking about the gate liturgy, and maybe we'll bring that out a little bit more as to how that actually looked in the time of the temple, and things like that. We can actually go into the Psalms and see some patterns of the way that they would sing, right? The way that they would praise God, and the way that they would have faith in his deliverance in their circumstances, right? Just like we like to read scripture and try to find those applications to our days and our lives today, and how we can have hope in what God is doing, and how we can also live according to this pattern of creation as God has set it up with our lives. And so, liturgy isn't a bad word. It's not something that is, something difficult. Like, yeah, Christian, again, the concept of time is liturgical. No other reason to invent timekeeping, because we need those patterns, and part of ritual is for us to remember and to participate with God. And if we don't have something concrete, we're just going to kind of float off into la la land and forget what we're doing, and how we connect with God and how God is working with us. And so those are really essential, important aspects of our lives.
Yeah, thanks for that. The last thing when it comes to Genesis 1, because now we'll switch to Genesis 2, is this. Uh, I'm going to mention this word that I never heard about, I never heard before. It's heptadic. I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. And when I checked online, it says that it means sevenfold, and especially in the Bible, the heptadic code is one of the exceptionally phenomenal codes. It means a paradoxical, repeated structural pattern of sevens running throughout and intrinsic to the entire Bible. Okay, so I'm learning. I hope you guys are learning. So this heptadic structure of Genesis 1 contributes to a liturgical framework, and it is reinforced through the parallel structure of the building of the tabernacle in Exodus. Very interesting. Moses is going up to the mountain, which comes mainly in order to receive the instructions concerning the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus 25:9, 25:40, 26:30, 27:8, and Numbers 8:4. Notes another scholar, Moshe Wainfield, a Jewish scholar, was found up with the waiting of 6 days, similar to the 6 days required in order to bring the work of creation to completion. Another scholar, P.J. Kearney, has argued that each of the seven speeches of Exodus 25 to 31, so these are the chapters 25 to 31, alludes to the corresponding day of creation in Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 and 3. Very interesting. The tabernacle's consecration process, lasting 7 days, evolves this heptadic pattern, so sevenfold pattern, similar to the creation account, and which is also connected to the Sabbath. Um, Carey, how amazing is that God does all these things that we discover so much later when we do parallels, when we do deeper biblical studies. I'm so thankful to scholars who find things that I will be never able to find. Examples are like, as the in Genesis 1 and 2, we see this cosmic pattern of the temple, that how they'll be structured. And part of that is also this repeated number of seven, sevenfold. There's nothing magical about it, but it's so funny how God works in the same way. And there's patterns throughout the Bible. And when we read the Bible, many times we don't pay attention to this. And then we see number seven, including Sabbath, being repeated, and we see another reason why when we read, for example, Exodus, like you mentioned, and when we compare this with Genesis 1, we see so many similarities. And another reason why Genesis 1 can serve as this pre-tabernacle being configured in the same way as the real temple and the real tabernacle will be established in Torah. So before we switch to Genesis 2, I don't know if there's anything you would like to add on this.
Yeah, I think that, again, people tend to focus on God acting in 6 days. Well, the pattern is seven. The pattern is seven. And so you can't leave out that seventh day when you're talking about creation. It's absolutely crucial. And so, yeah, I think that that helps to establish what we have going in Scripture. And really, I think one of the best pieces of advice for scripture reading that I ever got was to read Genesis over and over and over. Because if you can get that imagery from Genesis in your head, it really helps to see the rest of scripture, because you'll notice the same patterns, the same themes and motifs and numbers and repetitive ideas, things like that, that show up again and again. And a lot of times there will be additional meaning to those things as you go. Right here, we just have God acting in creation, but pretty soon we'll be looping in humanity into what's going on. And so you see the repetitive numbers, you see repetitive themes, and that's what I love about biblical theology, is it really helps you to get into kind of that mindset of study.
Yeah, before I discovered the beauty and depth of biblical theology, for me, systematic theology has for several years, alongside apologetics. For me, in my ignorance, I was thinking, man, this is the top of Christian theology. And then when I was discovering more of biblical theology, both at school, but also with help of Dr. Heiser and others. I just learned how much I didn't know. I learned how much ignorant I was. Systematic theology, historical theology, philosophical theology, they're all beautiful and have their own role. But biblical theology, learning to read the Bible in its original context, oh, it's superior to any other theology. We'll be switching to Genesis 2, and there are only a few things I would like to say before we switch to the last uh, key aspect or pattern, and that's when the person who comes to the cosmic mountain is meeting with the deity in order to worship him. So when it comes to Genesis 2, the root of the verb utilized for God's setting Adam in the garden is nuach, which means set to rest. And it is used in the nominal form to describe the resting place of Yahweh's temple. And this is cross-referenced with Psalm 132, verse 14. So again, Adam is in the garden where he sat to rest, and this is used the same place or in the same way as Yahweh's temple where Yahweh is supposedly resting. Uh, the Book of Jubilees, which I know is not in our canon, yet it's very important and interesting work. So the Book of Jubilees clearly comprehends Eden as a prototype of a tabernacle or temple, Holy of Holies. In another work, which is the Second Temple Literature, First Enoch, chapters 24 to 27, and Testament of Levi, 18, verse 6 and 10, they also closely associate God's temple with imagery of the Garden of Eden. So, Carey, this is not just found in the Bible, it's also found in Jubilees and in First Enoch and Testament of Levi. So it's not something that maybe you can find in one verse and try to establish some doctrine and people look at you like, are you serious? I don't see this, like it's very suspicious. But no, it's also confirmed in extra biblical writings. What is it? I don't know if you would like to say anything that comes to this that we covered, that in Genesis 2, Adam is placed in the garden to rest just like Yahweh, and also in these extra biblical sources we see this prototype of a tabernacle, temple of Holy of Holies, in the same fashion as the garden.
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier about how I think this whole theme can help us understand the connection between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And I think that even seeing Genesis 2 as a zoomed in account of Genesis 1, you can do that, but I think you really need to see how we have both the cosmic temple in general, the whole of the cosmos as God's dwelling, but also this particular space for humanity. And this particular space that is created on earth, where Adam was meant to be the priest and act in the role of the priest here. Again, this is going to be very helpful to us as we continue reading the Torah and seeing what's going on with the tabernacle, what the purpose of the tabernacle is, what the purpose of the nation of Israel is, to be that representative to the world, and be that in between for the situation of people don't know who God is. How are they going to find out about God? And so that is the role of mankind. That's the role of Israel. That's the role of the priest, is to connect heaven and earth. That's what we're doing here. And so I think if we can understand that we have the first man, Adam, as that in that role of being the priest, it's very helpful. And again, it can help us kind of get out of this modern mindset and into the ancient mindset of what would that look like? Why would that need to happen? Because there weren't even any other people, according to most people. Most people think there weren't any other humans around, right? So why would there be a priest? And so, you can go and explore these kinds of thoughts and ideas and have some new insight into what it means to be the priest and what it means to have God dwelling with you.
Yeah, it's funny how from Genesis to Revelation, they're priests, and we are called even under the new covenant to be the priests. Um, and this is another my ignorance. Sometimes in the past, I don't do this anymore. If I would try to debate with Catholics or Orthodox, I'm like, show me where the priests in the new covenant. And actually, you don't have to be dressed in a certain vestige and have a certain title and go to the certain faith tradition church to be the priest. Priesthood is deeply rooted within humanity as God's God ordained plan for us, and it's just so wonderful to see priesthood as one of many unifying themes from the beginning to the end of the Bible. The last thing when it comes to Genesis 2 is this: the parallels between the creation and Eden accounts and that of the tabernacle not only portray the tabernacle as a microcosmos, but also the cosmos as a micro tabernacle, with the Garden of Eden as the archetypal Holy of Holies in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. In effect, the earth is God's temple. This is so beautiful. So the whole earth is God's temple. And I would add on that, I would expand. Morales didn't mention this, but the whole cosmos could be God's temple if you think about this, where he can fellowship with humanity. The 7 days consecrated for the sake of that fellowship, defining the essence of humanity in terms of priesthood or for the sake of worship, thus completing our cosmogenic pattern through the waters to the mountain for worship. Carey, what is it that you would like to say about this and Genesis 2 and 3, and how tabernacle is seen as a microcosmos, but also the cosmos is seen as micro tabernacle before we switch to the worship part as the last key pattern for the podcast for tonight?
Well, there's a lot I could say. Like this is one of my favorite things. Like I said, getting into the work of Dr. Morales and the work of Dr. Walton and the work of Dr. Heiser, they have all brought forth these ideas of how I can read Genesis and see not only this ancient book, which it is that ancient book that is not a modern science book, that is not trying to present things in modern chronology, anything like that, but and yet it still has so much relevance to our lives and so much relevance to the way that we should be living our lives, the way we should be seeing ourselves in the church, the way we should see humanity as a whole. Like every human that we encounter is an image of God, and that is something very important. Some people aren't living out their lives like the image of God, and yet it is our responsibility to do that, to reflect God to other people so that they can know God. And that's just an amazing thing that we can do that in our daily lives. Like I don't even know. Like every time I think about it, it just overwhelms me with how much deep meaning is here in these chapters and how much God desires to be a part, for us to participate with him. I should put it like that, because that's why Christ came. That's why we have the church. That's why we go out and do our day-to-day lives, because all those things matter. It's not that we, have to wait until we die before we get to experience God's goodness and mercy and glory. That is not, it's not about us. It's about reflecting who God is. And all of that I just love it.
Thanks. Okay, now we're switching to the last key pattern, which we said the first two were coming through the cosmic waters, where the righteous person would be saved and taken to this place of sanctuary and refuge, sacred space of the cosmic mountain, on whose top the main deity, Yahweh, is waiting for you so that you can come and worship. So the last key pattern is called for worship, the liturgical telos of creation. And telos is another Greek word, which, like we said recently, just means this is your end, this is your goal, this is the purpose of humanity and you, why you were made to worship God. So we will examine how Genesis chapters 1 to 3 develops the themes of worship as the telos or goal of creation, then humanity as priesthood, and how the gate liturgy idea, which we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, naturally follows from the expulsion narrative. So let's start with the worship as the telos or goal of creation. Genesis 1 declares worship to be the telos of creation and constitutes a summons to worship, impressing upon its audience that creation is oriented to the Sabbath and thus exists for the sake of worship. Carey, what is it about us being made for worship? I know that sometimes I see these comments from atheists and our friends skeptics who would think, who see God as so selfish and egoistic, like, oh, if you don't worship God, he'll put you to hell. That's why he made you, because he needs to be praised. Like, is that why we were all made? I think they miss the key aspect of what worship is, and that worship, if you don't worship God, you'll worship someone or something else, and that worshiping God is not just bowing down and singing songs, it's the whole lifestyle. What is it that you would like to say about this?
Worship is for our flourishing. Like, yes, it's absolutely centered on God and who he is, and he should be our center, right? And to us, like, if I as a human wanted people to worship me, of course that would be self-centered, because what purpose and why should I be worshiped? I haven't, like, maybe I've blessed you in some way. I would like to think that the people I interact with have been blessed, but I don't have any call to be worshiped, right? I have something that reflects God, though, in me, just like every other person I had, like you and every other person I interact with has that divine reflection, right? We have that value because God values us. But God himself is the only one worthy of worship. And it's not because he's self centered, it's because he is the source of life. We wouldn't be here without God creating us, without God providing this earth and this world structured in the way that it is for our flourishing. And that is God's goal. Like, he didn't have to make the earth, he didn't have to make humanity. He didn't have to enter into humanity in the incarnation and suffer the things that he did and die and all of the things that happened with all of that. But he did because he loves us and because he wants us to be participants with him. Because he didn't create creation to just kind of sit up there in heaven and watch it like he's watching some football game, but he did it so that we can participate with him because he is a God of love, and he wants that relationship. He wants us to experience his love because then we can have that life and that flourishing. And so that, I mean, that's not really self-centered, is it? Right? And so I mean, I get the point. Like, if you were a human, we're not to worship a human because they aren't worthy of that. There is only one who is worthy of it. And he is worthy of it just by the fact that he is who he is. But because he is who he is granting us this life and this flourishing. And that should prompt that response of praise because we have that love and that flourishing because of who he is.
Thank you. Let me just post this. Yeah, the cosmic language of creation. Yeah, by Peugeot is a good piece of work. That's a good recommendation. I just wanted to show this so the audience can see. And again, thank you for Christian, and thank you for everyone contributing to the live post. It's been really an enjoyable night because sometimes I have people who want to come and insult my guests or come up with some weird theories and conspiracies, and I don't like that. So I really appreciate you guys being kind and being you know a good source of providing information, books, titles, and things of that sort for myself and for the audience. Um, Here I'm going to read two quotations from Morales, and then you can give your comment before we switch to humanity as priesthood. Given the temple imagery in the account, along with the later cultic appropriation of the Sabbath, it is likely that the supreme significance of the 7 days found in God's indwelling of the cosmos upon it, that is, in the ritual experience of the divine presence within creation. Some have hereby drawn an analogy between the 7 day rest of God and the bringing into a temple of an image of the deity during the process of temple dedication in the ancient Near East. On the 7th day, there is something of a bond or union between creator and creation as God enters his world, the king enthroned in his temple, vivifying and sanctifying it with his presence, the Sabbath being ultimately about the presence of God. Now I have something about the imitatio Dei and something about liturgy. Would you like to respond to this, or would you want me to read another quotation?
Go ahead. I think these are pretty connected.
Okay. The imitatio Dei, which means the imitation of God, of the Sabbath, which to the Torah is as much as part of the cosmic order as is the foregoing creativity, is found therefore to be a piece with the imago Dei, or the image of God, as the core of humanity's being and purpose as homo liturgicus, because it has to do with liturgy, right? So maybe liturgicus. And Morales says this: on this day, man must recognize the enthroned Lord of hosts, who, having completed his work, awaits in the attitude of majestic repose the liturgical response of his creature. How beautiful!
Yes. And again, it's not about this one-sided thing, but it's about participation, and it's about the flourishing of life and presenting a situation that can improve what we have, right? If we live lives that are disconnected from God, that are only self-serving, we are worshiping something other than him, which is usually, let's be honest, ourselves, and that doesn't end up going well because we're not we're not God. And so by having this participation with God, we can become in alignment with who we are, who we were created to be. And by doing that and living that out in a real, like, embodied way through things like liturgy and through things like understanding how our lives connect to the cosmos and to God himself, and how all of those things, they're not separate, they're unified, and they're unified in Christ. And so, everything that we do in church should respond to that and help flourish that, instead of making it about ourselves, making it about our performance, making it about, oh, I hope all of my congregants enjoyed my sermon today. It's about pointing to God and creating the situation where we are becoming who we're supposed to be. And that's a big deal. And it connects to everything that we're doing. Like I said at the beginning of this, I have been going into the topic of human sexuality in my podcast. And part of that whole thing is it's enriched if you look at how embodied humanity is and how we are supposed to live into who we are. And if we do that in ways that are in relation to what God has for us, then we will be more flourishing than if we choose to go our own way and worship ourselves.
Yeah, thanks for that. So again, we're switching now to humanity as priesthood, where Adam is portrayed as homo liturgicus or liturgicus. It's either or. So the first quotation is this one: considering the garden as something of the inner sanctum of the cosmic temple and its priest, the man with the woman to help him, the transition from Genesis 1 to chapters 2 and 3 might possibly be rendered as the movement from creating the cosmic tabernacle to establishing the priestly service of humanity. There's this movement from tabernacle to priesthood as seen in the transition from the latter half of Exodus to the first half of Leviticus. Genesis 1, thus construed, begins with the Spirit of God, chapter 1, verse 2, requisite to tabernacle building, Exodus 31, verses 2 and 3, and ends with a blessing and sanctification, 131 to chapter 2, verse 3 in Genesis. And these are fundamental to tabernacle completion and consecration, which are again parallel to Exodus 39, verse 43 to chapter 40, verse 9. And Genesis chapters 2 and 3 follow thematically with the first man invested with priestly duties amidst a garden richly laden with tabernacle symbolism. So, Carey, there's a lot of parallels again between Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and then Exodus parallels how Adam was dressed or what he will be portraying and doing, and then how priests were what we were doing. I know that you already said something when it comes to this section, but I was wondering if there's anything else that you would like to add on this, subtopic.
Yeah, I think that also I would suggest that a lot of times we think that Adam was kicked out of sacred space, so that means he's no longer a priest. But what I actually think we see in Genesis 3 is that you have Adam who is being presented as the true image of God, right? He is like an idol in the temple, not to be worshipped, but to be that reflection of God to others. And you see that because he's made out of clay, he has the spirit put in him. And this is very similar to the idol making rituals of pagan nations. And so you if you pay attention to the way that Adam is described, you see certain things like seeing and touching and hearing, and all of those would also be involved in the image making idols or of an idol in a pagan culture. And you would also be dressed like an idol would be dressed with clothing. And so after what happens with the serpent and after they're being kicked out, but God dresses them. So it's like God is saying, yeah, you guys have messed up, but I'm still going to have my purposes here. You are still my priest. You're not going to be in sacred space because we're going to have to figure out another way of doing it because obviously this one didn't work. But there's no ending of what God's purposes are here in spite of what humanity did. So I think, and the dressing of these clothes, we could see that as parallel to what we see with the high priest, who is dressed very similarly in the way that, again, a pagan idol would be dressed with gold and with jewels and with things like that. And he is supposed to be the living representation. Not for worship, because only God is for worship, but the idea there is that representative. The priest role is not separated from the ruler role. Yes, priest and king, absolutely. And I think there's something very strong to be said for the idea that Moses should have been both, and he refused. So, yeah, it's this whole narrative. Once you start seeing it in Genesis, you see how it's played out in the actual history of the church. And people keep going, no, we don't want to do it like you want us to do it, God. And God still comes back and says, okay, all right, we'll do it this way then. And he's still getting his purposes forward. And he's still having us participate in that, even as we are disruptive to what he's trying to do.
Before I read Sean's question, I have a question that just entered my mind a couple of minutes ago. So we don't know, at least I don't know, that Adam is the first high priest, if he was making any sacrifices, but at least he was the priest. How that was working out, I don't know. But since we're talking about him, And you said something important that stayed in my mind, and this is why I started thinking about people who came after Adam. So he was kicked out, but according to you, he didn't lose that priestly role. So could it be that um, Cain and Abel were, when they were presenting their offering before God, that they were doing that in a priestly role? Like, God, here's my best. I'm going to give you from my herds, but the other guy, I will give you from my crops. Could it be that it was in a form of a priestly dedication and sacrifice?
Yes, definitely. Those there's a lot of sacrificial imagery there. Now, of course, we are going to load in our ideas of what sacrifice is, and we're going to interpret that according to how we see what sacrifice is. And I think that the work of Dr. Morales was one of the first that kind of got me tracking along a different line of thought of what sacrifice is, rather than this common idea that I've seen quite often where sacrifice is giving up something good for God. As that's kind of our way we use the word sacrifice, right? Like, a soldier will sacrifice his life for the nation, or for his buddies, or whatever else, right? So we have this idea of sacrifice, of giving up something good, but really the term sacrifice and the whole concept was more of a shared fellowship meal. And so when we have Cain and Abel bringing the fruit of the ground and the flock, they're doing so in that circumstance of meal. Um, so the question then is, like, how does the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil fit into that, right? And the idea of sacrifice as a meal. But that's another topic for another time. But the idea there is this fellowship and this continuation of relationship. Like, we tend to think that God kicked them out of the garden and he's no longer associating with them. But he actually speaks in Genesis 4. He hasn't gone off somewhere. And he doesn't even speak through a mediator like an angel, but rather God is speaking himself. So there's still this intimate relationship that they're having, which I think that's really fascinating and easy to miss if you're bringing the wrong associations into what's going on there.
Yeah, thanks. Before we switch to another aspect of this um, second thing that we call humanity as priesthood, I want to read Sean's question for you. He said, is there a parallel between Adam entering the world from Eden, clothed by God, and Christ dying stripped naked on a cross?
That's an interesting question. I think that there is a lot of symbolism to being naked that we, again, miss today. And this whole idea of what shame is and things like that, that's again another topic we can't really get too much into. But the idea of being clothed has a long history of interpretation, has a lot of ideas associated with it, and a lot of different things, ideas there. But in relation to the idea of being the true image of God and being equipped to do the work, I think that's how we're seeing, that's how I read that situation with Adam and Eve being clothed. At least that's one layer of it. There's not just a single layer here. There's multiple layers of meaning, as we often see. And that's what the beauty of imagery and metaphor is, because you can have that layered meaning. Because as you go through scripture, you have new concepts added to previous concepts, right? So if something new happens to the people of God and it's in the pattern of what's happened before, but it's a new thing, and there's added meaning to it. So by the time we get to the circumstances with Christ and his coming, he is now the full revelation of God, but not just the full revelation of God. He is also the true man. He is the second Adam. So when we see these parallels with Adam and Christ, that should make us stop and go, wow, okay, what's going on here? Is there a reversal? Is there an intensification? What kind of a parallel? And so, yeah, it's a good question. I don't have much more of an answer for much deeper than that, because I haven't looked at the actual language of what's going on with Jesus and his clothes at the Passion. But I think there's definitely a lot there, because we do have that direct parallel of Adam and Jesus.
Thanks. Okay, the last thing about humankind being called to be priests, there's this quotation, actually two very short ones, that the garden narrative indeed portrays Adam as an archetypal priest ministering before Yahweh is supported also by the use of the verbs defining the divine intent, which are to work or serve and to protect or guard, being used together again within the Pentateuch only to describe the duties of the Levites. Very interesting. And another short quotation says that there has been a continuous tradition with respect to Adam as priest and sacrificer from Jubilees, which came in 2nd century BC, to the rabbinic period. Adam sometimes portrayed specifically as a high priest. So again, this is not something that Dr. Walton or Morales or anyone would invent. This was deeply embedded in the Jewish thought that Adam and the humankind were priests, and that this imagery and this belief continued even in the Jewish tradition outside the Bible. And what I find very interesting, that Adam had basically two roles: to work or serve, and second, to protect or guard, which were the similar duties portrayed in the Pentateuch, meaning the first 5 books of the Bible, as the duties of the Levites. Before we switch to the last section, so the last 15 minutes or so of the episode, is there anything you'd like to comment on this, or you think we already said?
Yeah, I think we've basically kind of brought forth this idea of what it means to be a priest and things like that. There's just, again, there's layers and layers and layers. And again, this is again why I love biblical theology, is because you can take the idea and follow it through and see how scripture builds on the idea from creation forward. And it's not that the ideas stay static, because they don't. And so you have archetypes, which are kind of the ideal or the epitome idea. And those are maybe the main example, but that doesn't discount the other examples we have that are different or slightly nuanced. And so when we come into the question of how that relates to the church today, there's different interpretations. And it's, people just want to have one interpretation, and I get that, but I think it's really useful and helpful to have the conversation from different angles, because I think it is very helpful to understand how we can still have hierarchy and structure, and that's not a bad thing. And it's not taking away the idea that we are also a nation, a community, a church of priests, a nation of priests, all of these ideas together. It doesn't have to always be an either or. So I think that's what I'd kind of present, is let yourself think about it in these layered meanings and see how it doesn't have to be just one thing or the other.
Thanks. Okay, so the last segment of this telos, or end or goal of creation as liturgy, would be again coming to the gate liturgy. And here we'll expand on what we mentioned maybe an hour ago. So we named this the gate liturgy, humanity's profound descent. Adam is the righteous one, able to ascend to the mountain of Yahweh, able to worship in the beauty of holiness. This understanding, however, is qualified in a negative manner in the narrative by Adam's expulsion or descent upon his disobedience, as that righteousness is now lost. Central to the account of Genesis 2 and 3 is the loss of humanity's approach to the Creator. a priestly laws entailing bared access to life in abundance, life that is in the archetypical Holy of Holies. So now Adam's expulsion from the summit of God's mountain may be seen as the very event that initiates and makes necessary the gate liturgy. Having been exiled by Yahweh Elohim, who now dares to enter? Who? The psalmist is asking in Psalms 15 and 24, who is the one who shall ascend? And this is beautiful, and kind of scary question that the psalmist is asking again in Psalms 15 and 24, that no one can ascend until we wait for the promised fulfillment of the coming Messiah who allows many of us to ascend because of him. Carey, what is it about this and the new covenant that you would like to say?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful picture. The New Testament presents individual Christians as well as the body of Christ as a temple ourselves. So we have that indwelling of the Spirit, which is what can allow us to have that presentation in the courts ourselves. And it's, it's again, it's this participation. And this is what God is after all of the time. He is after our participation with him in this whole goal of life. That's why we have creation. That's why we have new creation. That's why we will have the new creation in the heavens and earth, right? It's not just this idea of escapism, but rather an actual bringing together of heaven and earth, which I think that's just such a beautiful picture. And again, it's something we can experience here, which is hard for us too, because we do struggle. We do have difficult things. We experience death still. We experience struggling. And again, so did Christ. And that's also part of our participation. I was encountering an atheist friend a couple of weeks ago, and she was still presenting, no matter what I say, it seems like some people will hold on to this idea that Christianity is about living some happy, perfect life. And she's like, well, atheists can also live good lives. Yeah, okay. But are you living the best life? And are you acknowledging that your struggles are also part of being able to live that best life? And Christianity isn't just about rainbows and unicorns, it's about suffering. It's about encountering our lives in a real way, and the fact that God came down to earth to participate in that with us, to understand us on that level, is pretty incredible.
Thanks. I only have three more short paragraphs or quotation left, and we're done. Okay, the first one from those three. Rather than bringing Adam to rest in the garden of the tree of life, Yahweh God stationed the cherubim at the east of the garden to guard the way to the tree of life. Genesis 3:24. The word translated stationed or placed is freighted with tabernacle nuances, the tabernacle being the dwelling of Yahweh's glory and utilizing garden imagery, including cherubim. The presence of cherubim functioning as gatekeepers is precisely what sets the narrative within the context of the gate liturgy. Another scholar, A.S. Kapelrod, notes that cherubim of the garden narrative possess the two qualifications typical of Sumerian temple door deities. Number one being doorkeepers, and second one having a certain divine or mythological character. And once again, Carey, we see so many similarities between the ancient Israelite monotheism and how they had parallels in different Mesopotamian religions. I don't know if there's anything that you would like to say when it comes to cherubim being compared to maybe Lamassu or any other, doorkeepers, door deities in the ancient world. But I found these two qualifications, both in the Bible and in other Mesopotamian religions, very interesting, that they both had to be doorkeepers and that they both had to be divine or mythological. Not mythological as fake, but meaning, but I would say something that is like more than a human, so angelic, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and we tend to want to be like, okay, what did they look like? Where do they fit in the hierarchy? What kinds of creations are these? And I mean, I don't know. I think it's possible that heaven has animals just like we have animals, and so they're going to have different kinds of beings. But I don't know. The imagery behind those things, though, is very deep. Like it's very primeval. There's reasons why your average person has an aversion to snakes and spiders and things like that, right? Because there's something in them and our relationship to them that causes that kind of reaction. So I think that's what we should see, is that, and the question is, are we being, why are they guarding it, is what's dangerous, right? And the answer could simply be how C.S. Lewis describes Aslan, right? He's good, but he's not safe, right? So,
Yeah. Okay. In the words of another scholar, Joaquim Azevedo, his reading of Genesis chapter 4, verse 7 concludes that Adam's children brought their sacrifices to the gate of Eden. This is so wonderful. I never noticed this, never ever. This is why we need scholars. So, again, in Genesis 4 7, Dr. Acevedo concludes that Adam's children brought their sacrifices to the gate of Eden, which was accepted. Based on grammatical and syntactical considerations, contextual and background analysis, he posits, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, an understanding of Genesis 4 7 as the following. If you do not do what is right, fix it with the sacrificial offering laying at the doorway of paradise, and then his or Abel's desire will be to you, and you will rule over him again. So this is a very fascinating alternative reading of that passage in Genesis 4 7. And another scholar, R.M. Davidson, appears to take a similar reading when he writes the following. After Adam and Eve are expelled in their sinful state, they're no longer able to meet the God face to face in the garden. However, the gate of the garden becomes the sanctuary where Adam and Eve and their descendants were to meet with God, worship Him, and bring their sacrifices. Here, the Shekinah glory was manifested as God came down to hold communion with them. Carey, this is phenomenal, and why I'm excited because I mean I'm not a scholar. I don't. I learned some of the Hebrew, not Hebrew, biblical Greek back at Moody. I did not have Hebrew class. I didn't want it because to me it will be too complex. I don't know if you're familiar with this, alternative reading of Genesis 4 7. But if this is true, what these two scholars are saying, how cool and awesome is that God, even though he was righteously angry with Adam and Eve and their sin, even if he kicked them out from the holy place, but he put the cherubim to protect, he would still accept their sacrifices from their children coming at the gate, bringing sacrifices, and he'll come and meet with them. I haven't read much about this. I haven't studied this. This is the only place where I found this alternative reading. But to me, it's so fascinating because it just brings how big the heart of God is, that He still shows mercy to us as we do not deserve mercy. I don't know if you ever studied or encountered this before, but what is it that you would like to add when it comes to the descendants of Adam and Eve bringing sacrifices to the gate, and God will still meet with them? To me, this is phenomenal and super encouraging. But I'm ignorant because, again, until recently, I never heard about this alternative reading.
yeah. So in the context of Genesis 4 7, I have heard it and I'm not convinced myself, but I can understand how people get there. And part of what where you're going to land on this interpretation, I think, is going to depend on whether, or rather how, you see the role of sacrifice in the Torah in particular. Another place, so for those who are interested in this, he doesn't go into it too deeply, but especially considering our topic today, I would highly recommend Caleb Lewis's book, Through the Waters, A Biblical Theology of Genesis. He goes through and tracks the theme of the two goats, which we see on the Day of Atonement. We see he tracks that through Genesis and sees how people are in the roles of these two goats, one that goes to Yahweh, the other one that goes out to the wilderness. It's a fascinating book. He tracks some other things as well, but he does bring forth this idea of the translation that we see in 4:7 should maybe not be sin, but should be sin offering. And you can have either one of those translations because it is the same word. So, but the question is the sin offering crouching at the door of the tabernacle, the temple, Eden, basically? Is it not crouching as in a beast that's going to devour you, like it would be crouching, like it would be with sin, right? If sin is crouching at the door, if sin is crouching at Cain's door, sin is waiting for Cain to eat him. And Cain needs to rule over the sin and do rightly so that he can have that domination over sin. And there's other things like, well, maybe this is referring to a Canaanite deity. There's some language there that's parallel, things like that. But this other idea that the sin offering is lying at the door, it's not that the sin offering is crouching like he's going to devour Cain, but rather the picture there is that the sin offering is domesticated, and that Cain should use the sin offering in order to be right with the situation that has happened. But, and again, this is right before Cain goes out and murders Abel, right? So he's given a choice. He can choose to atone. Again, this is about how you see sacrifice and its role and what a sin offering is and what a sin offering does. Is it saying that Cain is supposed to be offering the sin offering as expiation for what he's done and what's going on? That's kind of that whole idea. And I'm not real sold on it because I don't think that sacrifice plays out the way that this kind of idea has. The idea that the reason they were offering sacrifices at the door of the temple was because they just sinned and they were expelled from Eden. And so now they have to offer sacrifices because of that. I see sacrifice in general as that fellowship meal, and they would be doing sacrifice not to appease the wrath of Yahweh, because Yahweh was mad and they had to make things right, but because this was now how they were going to fellowship with Yahweh, because they were no longer in his presence in the garden, but they had sacrificed to have that fellowship meal with him. Not that Yahweh needs meat and grain, but it's the sign that he is participating with man on man's level. Right? And so man could participate with one another with fellowship meal. They can participate with the deity with the fellowship meal. So those are the kind of two ways you can look at it. But I think both of the ways have that strength that I think that is appealing to you, that there is that relationship that can be had. In either of the ways, I think that is still core to what's going on, is that there is still that relationship that people could have with Yahweh.
Yeah, the last quotation by Dr. Morales is just basically adding on what both me and you said. I don't think it may need further comment, of course, unless you have anything to add. And then I'll give you the floor for the concluding thoughts. Namely, in the tabernacle cultus, which likely serves as a conceptual backdrop to the narrative, the door of the tent served as the place to which the people came to present their offerings to Yahweh, which we see in Exodus 40:29 and also Leviticus 4, verses 7 and 18. This cultic material of the Pentateuch, in other words, demonstrate a concern that sacrificial ritual takes place before Yahweh or at the door of the tent of meeting, making the garden entrance the likely place of sacrifice. Carey, I'm so thankful for this nearly 2.5 hours. Whenever I do an episode with you, it really stretches my theology, my biblical studies, my imagination, my knowledge, my understanding, everything. Again, doing these episodes, everything with you since the last year when we did the original Jewish monotheism, and then the episode on chaos, then Cosmic Mountain, and this one. These 4 episodes are so crucial to the podcast and to my theological formation because there's so much. I won't say hidden, but there's so much layered and dug in a way in the Old Testament that requires careful and persistent digging so you can come to this treasure and implement as another tool in your theology. And whenever we do these things, we always consult the best scholars we can find. And we learn so much from them, but also we learn so much from you. So before I give you concluding thoughts, I will just ask all the audience, please subscribe to Carey's podcast. As you can tell, there's so much she's covering. There's so much of the knowledge that she's using to, inform and instruct her audience. So what we're hearing tonight from her is just only a small portion of that. So please support her podcast. Subscribe also to this channel. We're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers within a month, maybe 2. Carey, I'm so thankful for your time and spending time with us. I hope, and I know the audience feel the same. And the floor is yours if you would like to add anything to this gate liturgy or anything when it comes to this huge topic of the cosmic mountain with all these tentacles as small subtopics and segments that we'll be covering both a couple months ago and tonight.
Yes. Well, thank you again for bringing me on for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Can you highlight that comment from Christian about sacrifice and the tree of life there? Yeah, the sacrifice was a replacement for the tree of life if you take Christ into account. I'm actually working on some project that's going to be coming out next week in association with other people, and this is basically my topic. So really excited to see him comment that. I'm like, yes, because I'm digging into that kind of material for this project that it's kind of a secret. I don't know if it's really a secret, but anyway, it's something that I'm doing with some other people that I'm really excited about to come out for next year. And so excited about that, excited about talking with you on all of these different topics and themes, because I really think these things can speak into the church in really deep, deep ways to help us understand Scripture, help us understand God, and help us understand our roles in the church and how we actually live our lives out as Christians in the body of Christ and in the wider world and what that's supposed to look like. I think all of that really kind of comes together in these themes of biblical theology that I think are just so rich and so deep. And we can spend our lives studying God and his relationship to us through his revealed word and through the way that we live with each other. And so I really appreciate what you're doing here on this podcast. I think that it's been so fun to see all of the different topics you do and all of the growth that's happening with your audience and with everything that everybody's learning. And it's so good because it is about community and learning together, and this is part of flourishing of life to me.
Well, thank you kindly. I also want to say that two episodes coming next week, number 84 and 85. 84 is their new gaming segment with Sean. We'll be covering God of War, Ragnarok, another great video game where we're planning to reach out to gamers, both Christians and non-Christians, since they seem to be more of a people who are loners, depressed, or maybe using games as a way to escape. We're trying to reach out to them, tell them that God loves them, and also to portray video games not just as hobbies, but as a form of art where God can still speak through this world building and storytelling, as each of these games has amazing music and soundtrack and graphics and videos and plots that we can compare sometimes to novels and movies. So we're trying to tell people it's okay to game, but it's also there's spiritual messages behind all of these games and stories, and we try to compare them with the Bible and pointing to Christ. And also next Sunday, several of us on the podcast, Troy, Sean, and Joshua Davidson, are coming to deal with the topic when it comes to the Judaizers. So they're basically Christians who wants to impose the Old Testament Mosaic law upon the Christians, telling them not to eat pork, that they must go to church or do nothing on Sabbath, that they're one of those people who among your midst who come and tell you that Christmas and Easter are pagan. They would invent all of these things, which of course not backed up by one scholar. One sound scholar would refute all of these things, yet they do believe in all these things and they're deceived. So we want to come and speak about these things in gentleness, but also in the spirit of truth. So please hang out with us next week. And until then, God bless you. Have a wonderful week. You too, Carey. May God keep blessing your ministry and your podcast. And see you next time. Bye-bye.